Hi everybody and welcome to Emsi webinars. We're really happy to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. Very excited because today we're going to be looking at one of our new tools that we've developed in response to obviously COVID and the recovery that we need. So the webinar today, obviously we're going to be covering how we can react to our economic disruption, especially in your region. And we have our host with us, Andy Derman, who is the Managing Director of Emsi. If you have any questions at any time, please put them in the question box at the bottom of the control panel, and we'll endeavour to get back to those at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to say hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. And hello and welcome, everybody. Broadcasting to you live from Emsi's UK headquarters in beautiful Basingstoke, which is not the skyline you see on the slides before you just yet, but once we dig ourselves out of this global pandemic, I'm sure Basingstoke will look like that soon. But anyway, thank you very much, Debbie, for setting this up, and thank you everyone for joining us. I will be joined a little later on in this session by some of my colleagues who will be sharing some input on what they're seeing in the different sectors that we're serving. But before we get into that, just wanted to really use this as an opportunity to pull together, I think, the latest challenges and a data view of what the labour market is looking like right now in this challenging time, but also start to really think about what this means for us in terms of driving meaningful action to really turn this challenge into what should be a fantastic opportunity in time for really resetting and refocusing our economy in a slightly different world, the new normal, as we keep hearing. So we'll plan on taking you through some various dimensions of that, and then, as I say, we'll bring in my colleagues who are serving different sectors that Emsi supports to kind of bring in some ideas and some views in terms of what they're picking up on. So thank you for joining us. For those who are new to Emsi, just wanted to give you a very quick introduction as to who we are. For those that are old, think of this as another piece of the indoctrination. But anyway, so here at Emsi, ultimately we care, are passionate about helping organizations to make better decisions as they relate to the labor market, and ultimately help the world of education, economic development, employment function more efficiently and effectively around the context of regional economic activity. And we do this through the wonderful power and medium of data. So we are busy pulling together insights and data together to help different types of organizations through a range of different dimensions. So our underlying structural labor market information, the various big data sources that we're mining and bringing to that data, so job postings, derived insights, and professional profiles data sets that really help contextualize what is happening here on the ground in the labor market. And as some of you may be familiar with and hearing more about, also really bringing our Emsi skills, open skills library to the fore to really start to help and think about the labour market, not just in terms of job terms, but more importantly, and probably more relevant to the way the world works these days, thinking about the labour market in terms of skills supply and skills demand. And we serve 3 core customer communities who in turn are serving the local communities that they do. So that's in education and skills, in economic development and regional planning, and also in the world of employment and workforce planning. And we'll reflect on these 3 dimensions later in the webinar when we bring in our Emsi experts in those fields. So we are all about the data, and so one of the things we want to start with then is looking at the data and thinking about this real call to action that we're hearing from our communities. And so I thought it'd be helpful just to run through a few headlines. These might not be particularly new to a lot of people. There's a lot going on in the media and press around what's happening out there, and a lot of visualizations of data, which I think is a really helpful as a data company. It's great to see data in the mainstream and in the thinking of what's going on. And so as we think about the emergence from the lockdown, and as things ease and we try and understand and make sense of the economy, we can look through a few different lenses. So I'm starting here thinking about employer demand and using the job postings data I mentioned to think about what does hiring activity look like. So job postings, online job postings data that we scrape, and we build structure and deduplication, so we can kind of get a sense of the underlying churn and hiring activity. And what we've seen is a fairly sharp drop since lockdown came into force in March, with around about a 28% fall in underlying job posting activity, which is a proxy we can use to understand employer demand. So pretty sharp drop there. And it's interesting to think about that on a geographic dimension. So whilst the underlying overall rate for the UK is at 28% of a fall, it's interesting to see how different regions have experienced very different trends. So we can see actually the north of England, Northern Ireland, Wales, whilst every region has seen declines, not necessarily quite so sharp in percentage terms, versus other regions, particularly the Southwest, Yorkshire, Humber, West Midlands, seeing a larger decline. And we can really start to look at the underlying nature of the economies of these regions to give us a clue as to why that might be. So you take the Southwest, which is very reliant on the visitor economy, and of course that is one of the key sectors that suffered the most through the lockdown so far. So hiring activity, employer demand as a proxy is down, but there are some hints of positivity. So on that previous graph, whilst it's down, you'll see that the move from May to June certainly is not as sharp as prior to that. So a sense of potentially bottoming out there. And actually, if we look at a more current view, so looking at job postings in the last 30 days up to July 20, when I pulled this data, we can see that actually the vast majority of occupation groups have actually seen a growth in activity. So a sense that we might be turning a corner here, led at the front end in terms of change at some of the lower skilled areas that were perhaps hardest hit in the short term. But actually growth pretty much across the piece. Interesting to note at the other end, health professionals, caring, teaching, seems odd. Why would that be down at such a time? Actually, that's just it's a vagary of the data to some extent, that these roles actually were pretty strong through the lockdown, pretty much covering key workers where there was still a lot of demand. And so relative to prior before those 30 days, we're seeing a decline, but actually that's held up pretty well throughout. So nothing to worry about there, I don't think. The culture, media and sports occupations is interesting because that certainly wasn't strong before and seems to be probably the last one to really turn a corner. So we'll keep an eye on that one. But some positive signs, which is good to see in the economy. So that's the labour demand side. Of course, the other dimension that has been very much in focus, of course, has been the cost of that downturn and the translation of that into unemployment and people losing their jobs. Now, for those who are scholars of the data, you'll appreciate this, but for those that maybe aren't so geeky as us at Emsi, you might not realize that actually trying to get a handle on unemployment is pretty darn difficult, because there are different ways in which we can understand that. So when we actually think about the unemployment, the official unemployment rate, you might be surprised to hear that it's actually pretty static right now. So this is data derived from the Labour Force Survey, the latest data published in July, which covered the period up to March to May. And we can actually see that the underlying unemployment rate has stabilized around about 3.9%, which seems a bit strange given what we've been hearing. But I thought it'd be helpful kind of to help you navigate some of these data sets, because a lot of the sense comes from the definitions being used, and so this labour force survey approach is using the internationally recognised definition of unemployment, which is basically looking at not just the volumes of people who are out of work, but they have to have been actively seeking employment in the last 4 weeks. So if you think about just the sharpness and the speed of the decline, of course 4 weeks has been a long time, and so what we think is this clearly is underrepresenting unemployment as we feel it and see it here and now. I suppose for a couple of reasons. One is 4 weeks is a long time, and people may have only just been made unemployed, and so not have been able to trigger that 4 week period. But actually, we've seen hiring activity has been low, and a lot of people have just simply not been actively seeking employment, in the sense that there's not been a lot of employment to seek, and therefore have not necessarily triggered the official definition here. And of course, there's a bit of a lag on the data. So the data runs up to May. We're in July now. Lockdown, of course, happened in March, but it takes a little while for these things to work through. So that's just one to keep an eye on, but interesting start point, because that's the official definition of unemployment. So we need to look to other data sets to give us clues as to what's going on. So one of the best places really to get a proper view is digging into some Department for Work and Pensions data around the claimant count, and this probably does give us a bit more of a recognition of what is happening. And what we can see here is the volume of claimants picked up through the claimant count, and of course a sharp rise from March onwards, pretty much doubling, although interesting to see that dropped away a little bit between May and June, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But again, just helping you to navigate the data. What is the claimant count? Well, this is data that combines claimants, so benefit claimants who are seeking job seekers allowance, but also universal credit as well, and where they are actively seeking employment. And so actually, because of the universal credit blurring, whilst back in the day we just used to have job seekers allowance and it had a very clear definition around unemployment, universal credit, of course, is a broader benefit that has various dimensions to it and can sort of probably blur things a little in terms of definitions. And so the general sense is this is maybe a slight overestimation right now of the actual volume of unemployed people, and largely on the universal credit side, where actually, whilst you could be seeking work, you can claim in-work benefits where someone's in a low-income role, so they're not technically unemployed, but they're certainly not earning sufficient thresholds to not qualify for benefits. And also we will find people who are maybe not actively seeking work, or are working through a number of programs because of barriers to entry to the labour market, those furthest from the labour market. So whilst it probably gives us a better view of the compared to the official unemployment rate, still probably worth considering that there are some vagaries to bear in mind in that data. And of course, the big challenge with those data sets is they're giving us headlines, but not really giving us anything that's particularly action oriented. And so when we pose the question, well, what types of people are seeking a job in terms of the roles that they have been made redundant from or unemployed from, we actually have to dig a little deeper, and we really only have the job seekers allowance claimant count data set to go on here. And what I've put on the screen here is the latest data from July that represents data up to June. So there's a month lag there, using the job seekers allowance claimant count. So that's a subset of the full claimant count that we saw, so a smaller volume. But what it does do is give us a sense of the job roles from which people have suggested they've been made unemployed from, so the previous roles that were undertaking. And again, just to help navigate the data, the good thing about the claimant count is, of course, that we can really start to get a feel for the occupational area that people are skilled in and trained in and have come from. And often the job seekers allowance cohort is considered probably those that are closest to the labour market, and therefore the the cohort that's most likely to get back into work quickest, perhaps, in such environments. People, they have a strong track record of working. They have contributed sufficiently into national insurance to be able to draw down the money, and so have been in work there. There are a few limitations, of course, for us to consider. I mentioned this is just a subset of the view universal credit has, which is obviously the long-term preference in terms of the benefit system, has blurred it a little. So we're in volume terms underestimating the labour market, and also certainly need to be mindful of that occupation coding, where that's being captured through interview via Job Centre Plus, I believe, and so there is an element of accuracy in defining the role that people had come from and accurately attributing that to an occupation code. So what we've tended to find is kind of clusters in very specific, obvious, fairly generic roles, rather than necessarily a spread amongst a wide range of occupations. And the graph we see here shows where that cluster is greatest. So very much in the trade and storage areas, and in sales occupations. You can see the wonderful occupation unknown category there, which is always a data person's nightmare, that and the not well elsewhere classified group. So we can see a range there, but what we've seen is very much at the low, perhaps the lower skilled end of the labour market that has been affected greatly, although interesting to see corporate managers also coming through in the top end, but the volumes are pretty low there. So different ways of really understanding what the unemployment picture might look like, and hopefully areas in which we can kind of track and keep an eye on over time there. But some trends starting to emerge now. We're a few months in post lockdown start. Of course, there is excuse me, one other dimension at play here that is sort of not employer demand and not technically unemployment, which is the take up of the job retention scheme, or we know it as furlough in common parlance. And of course, technically people who are still employed, but I think gives us a hint to where the risk lies in the labour market. Some of it might be simply about structurally managing through a short-term period of lockdown. I think the question is, how, as lockdown eases and the job retention scheme eases off as well over the coming months, how much of that translates back into active employment versus how much translates back into or translates into actual unemployment. I think we're seeing somewhere in the region of about 9.4 million jobs. Obviously a sharp rise in the early days of the scheme. That's flattened off in terms of take up of the scheme. And of course, this is a special statistic. It's something that hasn't been around for a long time, and by design won't be around for a long time either. So it's a good short-term measure. It of course isn't equating directly to unemployment, but it does give us that horrible doomsday worst case scenario, and one to keep an eye on as the job retention scheme is wound back and we start to see how that translates, as I say. So different dimensions there, and really, so I entitled this section the call to action. So what is that call to action? Well, that data is pretty clear in my view. The call to action here is really about how we support that growing unemployed population back into work, how we manage the reintroduction of those from furlough back into either the employment they had before or into new employment. But this is against the backdrop of a shifting economy now. Different aspects of that economy are waking up and emerging. Some sectors have been able to carry on largely as normal. Others are getting back up and running. Others are still very much struggling or unable to continue. And I think the third dimension, which is a really important one to consider, is that of geography and travel. So we've had a pretty fluid and flexible labour market in the sense that travel, commuting patterns, the ability to live in one place, work elsewhere, has been a fairly standard factor of working life for centuries now. It's interesting to see how that is changing both physically in terms of challenges around travel and movement of people, particularly with localized lockdowns becoming a thing now. But also a cultural and social shift around working from home, around perhaps a preference not to be spending so much time and money on commuting, etc. So 3 interesting dimensions that for me leads to a pretty focused call to action, which is we need to have those highly localized and targeted interventions. So locality is really quite critical here. And the reality is that labour supply and emerging labour demand may not necessarily be in the same shape, i.e. there's a realignment perhaps required here. So quite a complex call to action. So how do we prepare for this action? It's one thing, understanding what that call is, but of course, it's about then preparing and planning, and particularly about shaping local responses from my perspective. And again, we at Emsi pose that question, well, what data can actually help us? Ultimately, we've been tracking, and hopefully those that have been following Emsi through this period have benefited from some of those tracking resources that we've made available, the webinars we've run, the dashboards and reports we've provided. But we've certainly, over the last few weeks and last month or so, as the kind of path became clear, really turned our attention to thinking about how we can help our communities respond now. And so we've been spending time, I want to share with you kind of the culmination of that thinking about what data can we bring together that can help us respond. And ultimately, we need data that is localizable. That's one key critical piece. And data that will allow us to really make those connections between the potential supply of labor, i.e. that dislocated or unemployed workforce, connect that to where the demand is in that locality. So as we think about those data sets that we've just walked through and I've provided some headlines on, we really want to then think about, can we apply those 2 different terms to the different data sets we've looked at. So on the labour demand side, we looked at the job postings data, the Emsi job postings data. And of course, that, for those that are familiar, that data is localizable. So that data actually goes beyond local authority, but certainly consistently at local authority down to town level. And that data is available at an occupation level, and again, beyond into job titles as well. So labour demand, we very much need to be looking at job postings, and the value of job postings data, of course, is the currency and frequency of update there. On the labour supply side, particularly with the labour supply we care about most in this time of disruption, i.e. the unemployed population, we have those different dimensions that I shared previously. So the unemployment rate, so that official statistic is available down to regional level, government office region, but doesn't give us any kind of occupational clarification. The claimant count, probably more relevant right now, that is localizable, which is very helpful, but is just a headline volume. So whilst we can localize, it's difficult to really then look at the occupational profile. It's the job seekers allowance claimants that I flagged that does allow us to head into that that occupational dimension, and is also localized, which is very helpful. And the coronavirus retention scheme, the furlough data, is localizable. It doesn't allow us to get down to an occupation level. What it does provide, though, which I haven't noted here because of the occupational focus, it does allow us to have a sense of the industry profile, so what sectors are taking it up, because that scheme is managed through the employer rather than through the individual. So it has a sector view, but not an occupational view. And so really, if we're thinking about what data on labour supply and labour demand is going to be helpful to us, that gives us the local picture and gives us the occupational picture, we have our winners, job postings and job seekers allowance claimants. So whilst that JSA data we've noted is far from perfect, what it does do is at least give us that lens in. So how do we then bring these together to actually make it helpful and support this prioritization of local focus? And it's really about how you blend the two together. So think of a graph where we can look at the relationship between the volume of displaced workers and hiring activity. And of course, we have that linking factor between those two data points as occupations. So this is just a theoretical view here. We have various occupations that will find themselves for a local area on that graph. And of course, our focal point, really, our real urgency is about how we help those that are experiencing greatest displacement in the labour market, so where the unemployment rates are higher. And we can then start to think about different strategies we might deploy locally to support that priority community. So if we go to the top right-hand quadrant, well, this is where we have high unemployment, but also high labour demand. Well, here it's really about, I suppose, very much about how we redeploy that workforce. So in effect, they have experience and are skilled in those key occupations that are actually still in demand, and therefore it's about how we connect that supply and demand together. So your sort of typical kind of job brokerage employment schemes there, which should give us our quickest and wins. Of course, the other dimension where we have high unemployment but low hiring activity is not going to be quite so straightforward as connecting a few dots there. And this is where I think reskilling and upskilling very much comes in. So we have people who have a set of skills and attributes and experiences from their employment that perhaps in occupational terms aren't necessarily in demand. And so the question is thinking about how we can build on that skills platform to transition people. Similarly, in the bottom right corner, so relatively low displacement and good amounts of hiring activity. This is about how we need to really connect, not necessarily just with the unemployed people, but actually with employers, and to think about whether there are ways that we can move people from that top left quadrant, upskill and reskill where there is short supply of labour but high demand, and also move people into where there's this high demand labour. There might also be a fair amount of competition, but sufficient demand to manage that. So starting to think about some very specific strategies that are ultimately aimed about moving people towards where the demand is greatest. The bottom left quadrant, where we have occupational areas where perhaps there isn't a lot of unemployment, but also not a lot of demand, again, is about thinking about how we move people into where there are greater opportunities. And particularly that bottom right-hand quadrant is the ideal place to be heading, where there is typically employers that are really struggling to identify and find the talent that they need and where the opportunities should be greatest. So hopefully that kind of gives a sense of how, by bringing those two data dimensions together, we can really start to think on a local basis how we make those connections based on the occupations in play. And of course, the key, I think, to a lot of that is about how we deploy skills interventions to really help quickly move people from a position of challenge into a position of opportunity. And think of it in these terms. A job seeker will have their set of skills and experiences based on their work history, their education history, and we call that kind of the skill shape of that job seeker. And then, of course, all those job opportunities that are out there will have their own shapes, basically the skills that employers are seeking. And if we can really start to break down and understand skills, what skills are in demand, what skills are on offer through job seekers, we can start to look at the proximity there, and of course find where there are good close fits, certainly if we're looking at short-term interventions, and of course compare and contrast to start to understand what gaps we need to be filling. And so hopefully gearing up for pretty short, sharp skills interventions that can really quickly move people back into the labour market. And pace is important. We know from past experiences that the longer it takes to get people back into work, the greater the impact for obvious reasons, but also, you may have heard the term economic scarring previously mentioned. Really an echo moves through the lives of or the cohorts that are experiencing these challenges, and the sooner we can get people back into work, the sooner we can find we can minimize the damage caused. So our goal here at Emsi, of course, is not just theorizing what might be possible, but actually trying to help our customers bring those data sets together so that they can be driving those strategies. And, we are very clear that whilst we have a passionate mission to help economies function more effectively, we don't do that ourselves. We're a data company, but what we want to do is partner with organizations and agencies like yourselves who really do the hard work at the coalface. And we want to empower you to have that kind of insight to be able to help you make effective and efficient decisions that will really shape the action that your localities and your communities need. And so we are pulling that data together, and I'm pleased to announce that we have added some new functionalities into our data sets that will actually allow you, for your area, to start to look at the relationship between the job seeker allowance claimants and job postings in your area by occupation, so you can really start to think about those quadrants and really design activities associated with them, and connected into the wealth of Emsi data we hold on occupational demand, of course, the job posting demand, and also starting to think about some of those skills compatibility elements. And so you're able to dig into those kind of key priority areas and start to think about how you might realign that labour supply to where it's needed most in your local area and help your local area thrive. And so that is now available in here. Cue cheesy roll-in. This is now available to every Emsi analyst customer as a report. So you'll see the regional response tool. If it's not already in your analyst system, it will be soon. And feel free to chase up your account managers to get hold of that. So hopefully that's a really helpful tool for you to dig into and have a play for your area. I mean, you will see, based on the data that we've shared there at the moment, the job seekers allowance claimants is sort of showing a few key trends, particularly those lower skilled roles where the demand is highest. But I think it's definitely one not just to look at once and get going, but to track over time as we really unfold what the true impact of the lockdown, and certainly as the job retention scheme is wound back, we start to see those evolving needs in your economy. So that report is there very much to live and breathe over the coming months, and that underlying data is updated on a monthly basis as soon as the data is published, so that you can track how that's trending in your local area. I also wanted to share another piece of really interesting research that we've been doing to help, particularly in terms of regional planning and those driving engagement with employers and industry. So we have built, I say we, I would love to take full credit, but it's all down to the brains of the operation Duncan Brown on our team, who has built very quickly an industry exposure model that really is trying to get a handle on where the potential challenge, short to medium term challenge lies greatest, based on the conditions we're in right now. And this model is built two-dimensionally. So from a supply side, quantifying exposure by industry based on whether workers need to be in physical proximity to each other in the place of work to undertake their work, particularly where those industries and the staff are not classed as key workers. So when you actually look at furlough data and you look at it by industry, you can see a strong correlation between the volumes of workers that are furloughed and the physical proximity in which people work together for obvious reasons and government guidance. Where that trend is not holding true is in our key worker sectors, where there is a lot of physical location, but investment has gone into PPE and safe working environments. that enable those key workers to carry on. So obviously where you have industries that can accommodate working from home and distance working, of course the exposure is lower, or where you are a key worker sector, of course the exposure is high from a health perspective, but from an economic perspective, well, life is carrying on there. So the supply side dimension, but also of course there is a major demand side in the fact that certain industries have been switched off or had been switched off and are now starting to switch themselves on slowly. But that has a real implication on business viability, as we're hearing, and of course the exposure is greatest in those segments of the economy that have had to basically shut down for a period of time. But not just that directly, but of course the supply chains that they then rely on and the supply chain who rely on them for business are also affected, and so there is that kind of ripple through the economy within localities. So we've built a model that brings those two dimensions together, provides an index score by industry, so at the 4-digit SIC code level, and whilst that is an aggregated index for the UK, of course we can apply that to local employment profiles to really truly understand where the exposure lies in different localities. And of course that will vary based on the industry profile of an area. Here's a quick sneak peek, and as you can see, not surprising, your visitor economy is really exposed both on supply and demand, and we can see down towards the bottom some of those key sector workers. Of course, supply effects are still there, but the demand effects not so. Demand has maintained there. It's not so great and so impactful. So you can see that it is quite a variation industry by industry, and of course where you're a region, and we saw earlier the Southwest seeing job postings decline so greatly, well, that's a region that has a high proportion of its workforce in accommodation and in their visitor economy, and so we can see the impacts there. So that's a helpful model that people can contact us about. We are currently deploying that through our consulting work, but there is potential hope that we might be able to build that also into our tools as well, so we'll keep an eye on that one. So that's kind of where we're at, and I think certainly from our perspective where we see that action and the role that data can play in driving that action, I'd like now to invite, certainly for about 15 minutes or so, invite my colleagues who are at the coalface of Emsi's work in different sectors to join me through the power of technology, and really to kind of share. I've got a few questions for them to kind of get a sense of what are we seeing in terms of that action on the ground in our sectors. So we'll start off. I mentioned that a big focus for us is the world of education and skills, and I'd like to invite John Gray, our director who leads our further education business, to join us now. John, are you there? Okay.
I am. Good morning, Andy. Good morning, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks for joining us, John. So yeah, John, as the leader in the further education space, obviously we hear a lot about colleges very much playing a key role at the heart of communities, both from the learning that they offer and the impact that has on the regional economy, but also their physical location. You know, they are big visible buildings, a lot of them very nice and shiny, and exceptional locations. So you know, an industry at the heart of a community. What are you picking up from the FE community in terms of the role that colleges are playing or looking to play as they kind of think about the challenges facing the communities that they're serving?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So I think firstly, providers have been doing a great job responding to the challenge of delivering online learning en masse, and just trying to prepare campuses now to actually get back in September. And I know there's been some learners in throughout the last few weeks. So I think that's been a significant challenge as we start to have conversations and certainly get our heads a little bit above that water and look beyond. We've been having some really interesting conversations with some of our customers. So In terms of just kind of framing that, a reminder of a few of the initiatives and ideas that have been kind of banded recently, and that just gives a little bit of context to some of those conversations. So firstly, we've got the National Retraining Scheme, so looking at 12-week courses for adults that lead to guaranteed job interviews. We've then got things like the School and College Leavers Scheme, which will provide funding for 18 and 19-year-olds to complete level 2 and level 3 programs. So they're going to be particularly focused around a number of courses. I think it's something like 350. There'll be a number of those courses which will be available. And then another really interesting idea, which was posed by a Collab Group recently in a TES article, was that colleges could position themselves as jobs and skill centres in the short term to provide that initial advice and guidance and signposting. So a few really useful schemes and things out there and ideas. But ultimately, what's at the heart of all of these, and what we've certainly been talking to our customers about, is the need for really strong and robust understanding of what's happening in their local area. So a little bit like you've been just talking through really nicely this morning. And the discussions really about how we can use data as the basis to develop either new training provisions, so looking at that new maybe short provision to support reskilling, and using the skills data and looking at data where employers are starting to recruit again to build out those new programs, or certainly amending existing provisions. So this has been a big focus of discussions. So where we can modify maybe things like traineeship programs or apprenticeships or study programs to make sure that they're reflecting the skills which are in high demand within a local area. So some useful and very proactive thinking going on in lots of colleges. I think finally, just one point which I think has been really quite surprising and quite refreshing is lots of colleges have actually been saying, we're going to bring forward this year's planning process. So lots of our the FE market would start to plan around October time, but maybe a little bit beyond that. But certainly several in the last couple of weeks have been saying we're going to bring that process earlier this year to make sure that we're getting a really robust understanding of what's happening in the economy, and look at how we can develop short-term as well as the longer-term planning.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, John. Yeah, some good stuff going on there. So thank you very much for that perspective. And of course, you and your team are there, ready to work with those colleges who are looking to drive that action and maybe take advantage of some of those data sets that we just described just earlier for their regions. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you, and one to keep a close eye on. Richard Hewitt, who leads our work in the higher education sector. Hi, Richard, are you there?
Hi, Andy. Yes, I am, and hello, everyone.
Cool, good stuff. I know you're there because you're just literally on the floor above me in Basingstoke, but that's good to hear. So Richard, as our guru on the world of higher education, it's been really quite interesting. There's been a lot of talk in the media about and within the sector, hasn't there, around the kind of, well, that particularly potentially limiting opportunities for graduates entering the labour market, where of course the opportunity is very limited, and there's a hell of a lot of competition for jobs right now. And we talked about just earlier about the labour market scarring, and of course one area where the labour market has typically been scarred is where graduates haven't been able to find their way into viable employment quickly, and that presents a big challenge and obviously a missed opportunity all round. So what are you seeing, or do you think universities can be doing for those that are graduating now or recently and faced with this challenge?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right to highlight the problem of labour market scarring and the long-term impacts of having periods of unemployment on your CV. And this is something that I think both government and the sector have responded to. So, I mean, in terms of government, you see things like the Kickstart scheme, and the sector-wide, you've got UUK's policy proposals, which I know they're talking to government about. But if you actually look on the ground and see what universities are doing, there's an awful lot of good work that's going on, particularly in careers teams, who really are at the on the front line with this, with people, their graduates about to go into the labour market, who've been working really hard to set up work experience and placement schemes and get people into internships. So it's getting people into the labour market. And of course, there are ways to put that. It's also possible to put on hold that transition into the labour market with postgraduate education and as well. So those are the things which I think have really happened in the past weeks that have really made an impact. Of course, one of the things that universities have in their toolkit is an ability to link up their academic provision to the labour market and labour market data. They can do it at a skills level, and they can map the skills which are being taught in their programs and link that to what's happening in the short term in the labour market in the ways that you were showing. They can also take the recently published graduate outcomes data, and they can see how their graduates have actually gone into the labour market in reality, and from that they can track in the labour market data what is happening to jobs within those occupations in the relevant geographies to them. And this is really powerful stuff, because yes, it can drive advice or inform the advice that careers advisors are giving, and see, well, typically graduates from this particular program might go into these particular jobs, and be able to see to what extent they've been affected or are exposed to risk. And they can look at interventions, and the interventions could be things like relevant short courses that can help with that transition from a typical career path to maybe one that's slightly different, but has much less exposure to the risks in the labour market, and leveraging that full range, the full range of academic content that universities have. It's, if you think of it on a modular level right across an institution, there's an awful lot of short provision at modular level which could be repurposed and used to help people with reskilling, or indeed with graduates, and particularly the university's own graduates already in the labour market, with CPD and reskilling there. And we're also seeing universities looking at their apprenticeships and looking at what's happening in the labour market to inform their employer engagement. Which areas should they really be focused on, or perhaps considering moving away from in the short to medium term. The issue with core provision is always, is it something that can be changed for short term? And this could be relatively short term in the labour market. If we have a vaccine within a few months that's delivered, then the world perhaps goes back to some semblance of how it was. Of course, there would be big differences. Then if that happens, then you're looking at, well, what are tweaks that can be made to core provision, and that can happen at delivery level. You don't have to be completely changing your degree programs. You can be looking at, and we're seeing this happen at universities, looking at their schemes of work and thinking, well, how can we just tweak the skills focus that we have in our provision to help particularly those who are entering the labour market soonest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to talk about the core provision, whilst it's easy to think about this being a major unemployment issue right across the economy, we are seeing that there are still parts of the economy that are still struggling to hire the skills that they're seeking, that probably align most with the types of skills that universities are producing. So it's whilst there is a short-term challenge to fix, let's not forget about the big picture of the underlying economy and where it's going as well. And not get too distracted from that. So yeah, interesting. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, John, for providing a bit of an education perspective. Thank you very much. We'll may move on now to think about it from a kind of regional planning. So I mentioned that second dimension of our work, the work we do in regional planning, and we have joining us from Gloucestershire, Will Cookson, who leads our work in the economic development field. Will, are you there?
I am. Hello all.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks. So obviously, you know, local authorities, local enterprise partnerships are the civic leaders, and very much, and certainly when we think about local authorities at the coalface of a lot of the emergency response. And so what are you picking up then from the world that you're engaging with in terms of how local authorities and LEPs are really kind of seizing this moment and grasping the challenge and driving hopefully some great outcomes for their area?
Well, it's interesting, Andy. It's there's a slight mixture. Obviously, local authorities and local enterprise partnerships are quite different in terms of their remit and their capacity to be able to respond. So taking them one at a time, I think with the local authorities, particularly the larger local authorities, I know from speaking to them that they have quickly developed working groups, cross-partnership groups where they're bringing together local agencies, and they're well placed to do that, bringing in the third sector. Obviously, they have that line through to be able to engage with businesses, but then obviously they've got that responsibility to support residents. And one of the areas that they look to do that in is through connecting through to education providers, and also connecting through to people that are supporting employability. So there's, I think, and in its early days as well, in terms of coordinating that response, that's quite a lot of moving parts in order to be able to bring it together. But I do think that's where there is a real opportunity to meet the needs of residents and local employers. I think the other point that comes up in our conversations is that obviously there's a need to also meet priorities that were set out pre-COVID. So one of the recurring conversations I've been having is that underlying trends are still very much relevant. What your strengths were within your local economy down to local authority level, essentially that may be impacted by the current crisis, but there's still a need to see whether displaced workers can be aligned to support growth opportunities in the long term. And that's definitely an issue that is relevant to both local authorities and to local enterprise partnerships. We know with local enterprise partnerships, they've got existing mechanisms that can be harnessed to shape local responses. Think of the skills advisory panels, which are going very strong. They're in their second year. And obviously there's that onus on local enterprise partnerships to revisit their local industrial strategies and to identify where there's opportunities to continue to support that agenda around growth. So while growth might seem very optimistic at present, it's still very much at the forefront of where we need to get to long term. And there's obviously a mixture of responses that have been looked at within that. But yeah, it tends to come back to, as you'd imagine, skills, employment, and working across a broader range of organisations to get a coordinated response.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Will. I'm sorry for talking over you earlier. Interesting point about, you know, considering the strengths we have in the underlying economy and using that to grow from a position of strength and to harness that. Of course, where those strengths may align to where the exposure is greatest, that presents challenge, but where it doesn't, of course, that presents massive opportunity to work through. And I had the opportunity to contribute to a recent, just talking about the local authority kind of coordinating response. I had an opportunity to contribute to the Basingstoke Business Summit recently, where there was some great ideas about actually just how we embrace this and this challenge and flip it into an opportunity and really use it as an opportunity to kind of push Basingstoke forward as part of its existing strategy, but just to start to tweak it around some of the pragmatic realities. So very interesting. Thank you, Will. And just quickly before you go, you're also leading our work in the employability sector. So just a quick word in terms of what you're seeing from that kind of traditional welfare to work world, which of course is very much gearing up to be at the front line of responding.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, I know that sector fairly well through previous roles. What we're seeing is really a need and a desire to look at how operationally they can ramp up and meet the challenge. We know that DWP will be commissioning a new program which will go live in April, but I feel like there's a real desire to look at how data can be brought in, evidence can be brought in to inform different ways of working operationally. And I think that's coming back to a recognition of the labour market is going to change considerably. There's going to be a lot of new customers with probably a broader range of customers coming into the labour market at high volumes. But obviously there's a desire for the organisations to still meet the needs of those that are furthest from the labour market. And obviously there's potentially they could fall to the back of the queue in terms of employment opportunities. So I think there's still as a recurring theme here, but there's still definitely a understanding that skills interventions are key to being able to support people back into employment, but also acknowledging that data and evidence needs to be brought in to support their local responses and to ensure that it's right for that local economy. Yeah. I think the final point I'd make is that higher competition around employment means that particularly welfare to work companies are looking at different ways in which they can support their employers at scale, with some really interesting initiatives as well that we unfortunately don't have the time to go into now.
Great, thanks, Will. Maybe a future
Thank
webinar.
Yes,
thanks very much for joining us, Will. Appreciate that insight. And finally then, that employer perspective, and I'm welcoming in Matt Mee, who leads our workforce intelligence division that focuses in our work in the world of recruitment and employment. So Matt, are you there?
Yeah, hey Andy, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. So he's somewhere in Mars, International Space Station.
No, I mean, good to be here, and I'm conscious of time, but I think, you know, from an employer's perspective, obviously we're moving from what's been a very tight labour market over the last number of years to obviously one where there's a lot of people who are now sort of looking for work, and supply is obviously increased relatively. So, you know, that poses a number of different challenges. I think the main thing that people are really looking at right now is the extent to which furlough unfolds into unemployment and what opportunities and challenges that creates. And as you say, we work across a number of sectors and helping sort of people understand that kind of insight. If we take the corporate market as an example, so employers who are now fundamentally rethinking their workforce strategy. So there's opportunities to think about, do you buy, do you build? You know, there's a surplus of great talent available on the markets, but the way in which you can engage that talent is changing. And so that's going to be really interesting to watch at different areas of the labour market, because, you know, we've kind of got the highly skilled end of the labour market where you've got people that can now work remotely. So perhaps borders have come down in terms of the ability to engage that kind of talent. You've got sort of the middle management populations of the workforce that perhaps companies are looking at, you know, commercially, what can they afford to have? So perhaps we'll see shifts there in terms of, you know, more people who've been in those mid-skill, mid-management roles being available and having to think about upskilling and changing their careers. And then at the, I guess at the operational end of the market, it's sort of the lower skilled yeah, we've got, I think about 40% of the furlough workforce is actually in that bracket of being paid under £10 per hour. So, that's a big concern that I think some of our tools are going to be really helpful, sort of helping navigate how do we redeploy those people. And then just a couple of other quick thoughts. Yeah, obviously the recruitment sector, we do a lot of work in that space. There's been huge innovation there, some great examples of companies really pivoting their business models. Things like the Feed the Nation program or the Keep Britain Working program have been really innovative, and I think we'll continue to see great innovation in that space, particularly in the freelance market and kind of contingent worker solutions. And then lastly, just the real estate market is really interesting, because obviously real estate companies have been hit very hard by the nature of what workspace do companies now need, and some really interesting research there that's coming through from Cushman Wakefield as an example, looking at the move to working from home. And what's the purpose of having an office? Is it shifting from a place of work to a place of innovation, learning, and collaboration? So some really interesting themes, and COVID is, it's been a catalyst for changing work as we know it.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks, Matt. And as I think you're hinting at there, a lot of the underlying factors that we've been thinking about and talking about openly for some time really being brought to the fore with a bang, really.
Yeah, 100%.
Particularly majorly different, but very interesting. Thanks for your perspective. Cheers, Matt.
Pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to the Emsi team for joining. I hope you found that useful, just kind of getting a few different perspectives of what we're hearing and seeing, and thinking about obviously the role that data and localized data can play. Just wanted to point you very quickly on closing towards some further resources. So keep an eye on the Emsi blog. We are looking. We had our data dashboard there tracking employment or lack of. Opportunities through the early stages. Our intention is very much to bring through some new insights there, so keep an eye out there. We're just working on a few things there, and the blog will also be the place for some of the kind of data articles that we're pulling out as new data becomes available. We also have a number of webinars in the offing around maybe digging into some of the themes we heard briefly here. I can point you towards a webinar on the 30th of July, which is in our FE division. Anthony Horn on our team will be really digging into some of the themes that John shared with us here, and we're pleased to have Tom Lowe from the CoLab group, and we heard the CoLab group mentioned earlier around some of the ideas that they're bringing forward in terms of positioning FE to be a key driver of response. So that should be a really interesting and exciting webinar, so feel free to sign up to that one. I also thought it'd be helpful to point you towards one of our partners, the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Not sure if you've seen this, but they've been pretty active, certainly on BBC News recently, in helping to shape and understand how jobs are recovering. They are, in fact, partnering with us and using Emsi data to drive that forward, and they have a really helpful jobs recovery tracker with regular press releases of latest insights that they're gleaning from mining the data. I'd encourage you to keep an eye on that. They've got some great ideas and views coming through there, so please do check that out. And just wanted to now close. I'm mindful we've run over a few minutes. I apologize for that, but thanks for sticking with us. Hope you found that useful. Love to hear your experiences, your views, your ideas, and if there are particular topics or themes that you're agonizing over that you think would be useful to explore in this environment, we're all ears for sure. So please do reach out, please do get in touch. Thank you to my Emsi colleagues for joining us. Thank you to you for joining the webinar. I'll hand back to you now, Debbie. He says, throwing Debbie under the bus, sorry. So I was just going to have a quick look at some questions to see if there was anything there. I think with the time in mind, some good questions, but I'm going to need to dig into some of those. I think we'll need to come back to you guys with some ideas, some responses to those. So I'll distill those down, and we will come back to you and get a note around. So a recording of the webinar should be coming out shortly, so you can watch it till your heart's content and share that with colleagues and friends. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the week and a great weekend.